I was recently speaking with a self-proclaimed patriot, the kind of a guy whose eyes tear up when he talks about the Founding Fathers. He was incredibly animated, practically preaching about how we need to return to the original intent of 1776.
Oh, I think I know the type.
Exactly. He spoke about Washington and Jefferson as if they were these divine figures, and he was insisting that they believed in pure individualism and would have despised the modern welfare state. To him, the founding era was this golden age where no one expected a handout.
It's a very common narrative, a very powerful one.
So I decided to test the waters a bit. I pitched him a specific policy idea, but I didn't mention its source. I described a system where the government would impose a 10% inheritance tax on all large estates.
Okay.
And that tax would fund a universal cash payment for every citizen when they turn 21, along with a guaranteed annual pension for everyone over 50.
And what was his reaction?
The shift in his energy was immediate and honestly violent. The reverence just vanished, and it was replaced by this look of sheer disgust. He cut me off, calling it socialist garbage and radical wealth redistribution that would destroy the American work ethic.
Of course, that's the standard playbook reaction.
He was so confident. He told me that if the founders heard an idea like that, they would roll over in their graves. He was absolutely certain that this idea represented everything the revolution fought against.
And here comes the punchline.
Here's the irony. I didn't pull that plan from some modern progressive think tank or a European socialist manifesto. That proposal was written in 1797.
Wow.
In a pamphlet titled Agrarian Justice.
Yeah.
And the author, Thomas Paine, the very man whose words sparked the American Revolution and who literally popularized the name the United States of America.
That's incredible.
That disconnect between the founding father we worship and the actual radical ideas he held, that is exactly where our story begins today.
It really is.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into the truly radical Thomas Paine. The author of Common Sense and Rights of Man is celebrated as a political revolutionary, but the American narrative systematically sanitized his most daring proposals, the ones aimed at economic justice and dismantling the aristocracy of wealth.
They kept the parts they liked and threw the rest away.
Our mission is to uncover these neglected ideas, focusing on his detailed blueprints for what looks like universal basic income and his, truly shocking 100% marginal tax rate on extreme wealth. And we want to understand why these 18th century plans are so startlingly relevant to today's battles against inequality and oligarchy.
It's an incredible intellectual puzzle. I mean, the figure we publicly honor for his political insights, the firebrand who crystallized the entire argument for republicanism, was simultaneously an even deeper economic reformer. He was laying the groundwork for what we now understand as the comprehensive social safety net.
You hit on the core insight there. For Paine, political freedom and the ability to be a self-determining citizen were inextricably linked to economic security.
Absolutely. You couldn't claim to have a truly free republic if the majority of your citizens were subject to the economic domination of a wealthy landed minority. Yeah. He saw economic reform not as a footnote, not as a nice to have. It was a mandatory component of a genuinely free society.
Okay, so let's unpack this first major proposal, agrarian justice. This is the source of that inheritance tax and the universal payments. The whole concept is predicated on a philosophical leap, a contention about natural law that is just fundamentally radical, especially coming from a figure of that era.
It is radical, but the way Paine framed it, he treated it as simple logic. He started from the premise of the state of nature. In this original state, before any human laws or organized society, the earth was the common property of the entire human race.
And a shared inheritance.
Exactly, a shared inheritance, a divine gift to all. And this wasn't just some political rallying cry for him. It was his intellectual foundation. Everything else is built on top of that single idea.
But history, particularly the history of Western civilization, is the story of enclosure and private property. So how did Paine reconcile that natural common state with the reality of 18th century Europe, which was just dominated by these massive private estates?
That's where he introduces what he calls the injustice of civilization. Paine wasn't an anarchist. He recognized that private ownership of land was, in some ways, necessary for human progress.
Right, you need it for farming, for building things.
You can't cultivate land efficiently, develop complex agriculture, or build a society unless you have some security over your improvements, the houses you build, the crops you sow. The trouble is, by allowing the private exclusive ownership of the land itself, civilization dispossessed all the non-property holders of their natural inheritance. They lost access to what was originally their birthright.
So the very act of creating civilization, which increased overall productivity and wealth, simultaneously created a massive societal debt to the people who are now landless.
Precisely. And this is the intellectual bridge to his policy. This debt is what justifies the ground rent. And you have to understand, this isn't a tax on income or a levy on consumption in the way we think of taxes today.
What is it then?
It's a mechanism where property holders, those who benefit most directly from enclosing and cultivating the common inheritance, must compensate the rest of the community for the loss of that common resource. For Paine, private property is only morally justified and politically stable if the basic needs of all humanity are provided for by property holders as a mandatory payment to the non-property holders.
Wait, so if this is restitution for a lost natural right, doesn't that immediately address the critique that this is socialist garbage or just a handout?
It completely reframes it.
It makes it a mandatory return on communal capital.
It's a genius rhetorical maneuver because it anticipates and preempts that standard conservative critique. He wasn't proposing confiscation. He wasn't demanding that the state nationalize land. He was saying, you can enjoy your private property, you can improve it, but you owe the community a dividend from its value because you are exclusively holding what was originally communal.
And that's why some historians have pointed out this isn't proto-Marxism.
Not at all. It's a unique non-Marxist critique of the free market that specifically did not plan to limit the acquisition of property. It just limited the uncompensated retention of its value. That's a huge difference.
Okay, let's transition from the philosophy to the mechanics, the policy blueprint that he laid out in 1797. This plan, which sounded so radical to my patriot friend, is a perfect, detailed precursor to modern systems like UBI and Social Security.
It was incredibly sophisticated for its time. It was designed to be funded by taxing accumulated wealth, specifically land once per generation. The funding centerpiece was an estate or inheritance tax.
The 10% figure I mentioned.
That's the one. He proposed a tax on all direct inheritances. So those going to close relatives at 10%. And then inheritances going to indirect relations, more distant family, would face a somewhat higher rate.
And he ran the numbers. He thought this was a viable plan.
He did. Paine estimated this system was robust enough to raise a considerable amount, roughly £5,700,000 per year.
That's a huge sum for the 1790s. What was the dispersal mechanism for that fund? How did the money get back to the people?
2/3 of that annual fund was dedicated to payments for seniors. Every single person over the age of 50 would receive £10 annually.
Why age 50?
Paine deliberately chose 50 because, sadly, that was the contemporary average adult life expectancy after surviving childhood. So it was really designed to provide dignity for those entering the last phase of life when they could no longer work the fields.
A proto-social security system. And it's based on this premise of compensating a loss, not on charity. Then there were the payments for the young.
Exactly. The remaining portion of the fund was mostly earmarked for a one-time lump sum payment of £15. And this was to be distributed to every man and every woman upon reaching the age of 21, which is the age of legal majority back then.
And he had a name for this.
He called this seed capital, or a maturity payment. The goal was to give young people, especially those born without any inheritance, a fighting chance. It was a financial stake to start a business, learn a trade, or buy tools without being immediately crushed by the weight of economic dependency on the aristocracy.
To really grasp the impact of this, we need to contextualize those figures. I mean, £10 or £15 sounds trivial to us today, but in 1797, how far did that money actually go?
It was truly meaningful. It's not an exaggeration to say it would have been life-changing for most people. Consider this. Records from around 1795 show that the average annual income for a fully employed, able-bodied agricultural laborer, someone working 6 days a week, all year, at about 9 shillings per week, was only approximately 23.3 a year.
So the £10 annual pension was nearly half of that person's entire annual income.
Nearly half. It wasn't full subsistence, no, but it was a transformative safety net designed to prevent old age destitution. It was the difference between begging on the street and having a roof over your head.
And the £15 maturity payment for a 21-year-old?
That was even more significant in a way. It was more than half the average yearly wage. For a young person with nothing, £15 was enough to buy livestock, a full set of artisan's tools, or make a down payment on a lease for a small plot of land. It was a real launch pad.
So we're not just talking about two payments here. This was a vision for an integrated, robust social welfare system. The sources indicate he outlined 7 specific entitlements.
It was a full social justice manifesto, truly. Beyond the universal payments for seniors and young adults, he proposed grants of £4 per annum specifically to subsidize schooling. He recognized that education was essential for citizens in a republic.
So public education funding.
In essence, yes. He also included one-time payments for newly married couples and for new parents, offering a form of early family support. There were back-to-work schemes, burial benefits to ensure dignity in death for the poor, and maybe most radically, a call for the complete elimination of taxes on the working poor.
Why that specifically?
He recognized that oppressive taxation on those already struggling was just fundamentally immoral. It was a poverty trap. You can't ask people to contribute to the state when they can't even feed their families.
That level of detail is just astonishing. It truly reads like the foundational documents for a modern welfare state 2 full centuries before the fact.
That's the key takeaway here. Agrarian Justice was an extraordinary social justice manifesto. The sheer scope and the financial viability of the plan, he wasn't just proposing payments. He provided a detailed progressive funding mechanism. That's what makes Paine so unique among the founders.
And the fact that this document, which connects political liberty so directly to mandatory economic security, was systematically obscured from the national narrative.
It's central to understanding how the American founding myth was constructed. They loved the political revolutionary, but they had to erase the economic radical.
All right, so if agrarian justice was about restitution for lost communal property, Paine's earlier proposal in the 2nd volume of The Rights of Man was something else entirely. It was a direct assault on inherited power. And this is where he introduced the concept of the 100% marginal tax rate.
This is where Paine stops asking for compensation and starts demanding the systemic dismantling of concentrated wealth. He begins by critiquing the superficiality of typical taxation measures of his era, particularly what was called luxury taxation.
Right. He noted that governments often tried to tax things that only the rich purchased, like fine goods, or in the case of Britain at the time, the infamous commutation tax on windows.
Exactly. The logic was, rich people live in big houses with lots of windows, so taxing windows is progressive. But Paine just dismissed this as a fool's errand, because luxury taxation is flawed. Luxury is constantly shifting, it's subjective, and it's easily disguised. You simply tax one thing, like windows, and the wealthy will find another way to display their status. Paine's core insight was brilliant. The real luxury does not consist in the article, but in the means of procuring it.
The actual luxury isn't the diamond necklace or the big house with all the windows. It's the underlying, untouchable pool of wealth that allows you to buy anything you want whenever you want.
Precisely. Therefore, he concluded, the proper object of taxation is the overgrown estate, which is, by its very definition, a luxury at all times. This move redirects the entire focus of the state away from penalizing consumption and toward limiting dangerous accumulation.
This philosophy led him to define a threshold for what he called prohibitable luxury, a level of wealth that he believed crosses a line from personal success into a kind of political danger.
He did. He set an approximate benchmark of what was necessary to support a respectable family. He estimated maybe £1,000 per year in return from property. Anything above that became subject to his graduated tax. He insisted that for estates worth over a certain high figure, there was a point where, and this is a direct quote, there ought to be a limit to property.
A limit to property? That sounds very radical.
It does, but you have to be precise. It wasn't a limit on property acquisition per se, but a limit on the unconstrained return derived from that property. A subtle but very important distinction.
So let's look at the structure of this limit. It was a graduated marginal tax on the returns from wealth, which starts gently but then escalates with frightening speed.
It targeted the clear yearly value of the estate. So the income or the return derived from the land or assets, not the total net worth itself.
Yeah.
It began pretty modestly, starting at just 1.25% on annual returns above £50. But the rates quickly shot up.
How quickly?
They hit 10% on returns around £5,000, at 50% at £13,000, and they just kept rising sharply from there to that absolute ceiling.
Which was 100%.
Yes, 100%. The marginal rate hit 20 shillings in the pound, which is 100% on any return value over £23,000. And Paine wasn't subtle about the goal. He stated it plainly. Consequently, every thousand beyond that sum can produce no profit.
Wow. So he didn't expect to collect much revenue from that top bracket.
Not at all. The tax was a political tool. He explicitly believed this 100% rate would force large property owners to respond by dividing the estate, distributing their holdings among their children or selling them off, thereby surgically reducing aristocratic power before it could be passed to the next generation.
This was clearly designed as a direct surgical intervention against the 18th century British oligarchy. Who exactly was he trying to kneecap with this tax? Who are the targets?
He was targeting the ultra-elite, the 1% of the 1%. At the time, only about 200 households in all of Britain had incomes high enough, £13,000 or more, to even face a marginal rate over 50%.
So the highest bracket, the 100% rate that kicked in at £23,000, was reserved for the true landed gentry, the people who had amassed multi-generational wealth and power.
The dukes, the earls. That's who he was after.
Give us a concrete example of the damage this would have inflicted. We know the dukes were in his sights.
Absolutely. I mean, think of the poster children for these overgrown estates. The Duke of Devonshire, who had an income of about £50,000, and the Duke of Northumberland, whose income was even higher at £60,200 a year.
Staggering sums.
Under Paine's aggressive structure, they would have been left with a maximum allowed post-tax revenue of about 12,369% in 1792 terms. The Duke of Devonshire's average tax rate would have been 75%. Northumberland's would have been 79%. This wasn't just a revenue measure.
No, this is a cap, a hard cap on wealth generation from existing wealth.
It is.
So this is what economists now call a Pigouvian tax, right? It's a tax intended to change behavior.
Exactly. A Pigouvian tax is a tax levied on an activity that generates negative externalities or undesirable social costs. In Paine's view, extreme wealth concentration was a negative externality because it corrupted elections, it diminished patriotism, and it fostered economic domination.
The tax was designed not primarily to raise money,
but to correct the market's failure to limit wealth. Success meant collecting less revenue from the top brackets over time, because the tax successfully incentivized the wealthy to reduce their concentration by dividing their estates. It was meant to make the practice of primogeniture, passing these massive undivided estates to the eldest son, economically irrational.
That's a powerful tool, but this historical analysis introduces some complicated issues that still plague modern tax debates, particularly the distinction between taxing income versus taxing wealth.
It does, and Paine's writing is right in the middle of that ambiguity. Remember, he taxed the yearly value or produce of the estate, which looks a lot like an income tax on wealth. But he was specifically targeting wealth holders, the aristocrats, not salaried wage earners. This distinction between the wealth corpus, the total assets like a house, and the wealth return, the income derived from those assets like rent, is subtle but absolutely vital.
And it raises the question of imputation versus actual cash flow. What does that mean exactly?
Well, imagine a duke owns vast tracts of beautiful land that he just keeps vacant or uses for fox hunting. It produces zero cash flow. Should that land be taxed the same as developed land that's generating rent?
That's the question.
If you follow Paine's stated goal to prevent the unproductive hoarding of land by the aristocracy, then yes, it absolutely must be taxed based on imputation. Imputed value means you assign a theoretical yearly value to the asset, say 5%, regardless of whether the owner chooses to monetize it or not.
And if you don't tax based on imputed value,
then the wealthy can simply hoard power in non-liquid assets like art or empty land without paying the tax, which directly undermines Paine's entire political objective.
There's a related ambiguity, debt. Could an oligarch just borrow against their estate to reduce their tax liability, claiming their yearly value is tied up in debt service?
That's the classic modern loophole, but Paine explicitly closed it. He allowed deductions only for the land tax itself, the original property tax. He makes no mention of allowing deductions for borrowing costs or interest payments.
So leveraging your assets wouldn't save you?
No. Allowing debt to reduce tax liability would protect the very luxury enjoyed by the wealthy, the ability to leverage massive assets, and would directly sabotage his goal of limiting aristocratic power. The tax base was clearly designed to be hard-edged and focused only on the accumulated value, irrespective of how the aristocrat chose to finance their lifestyle.
Okay, let's do something interesting. Let's apply this radical 1792 plan to the 21st century. What does Paine's 100% marginal rate look like today in dollar terms?
This is where it gets really fascinating. First, we have to anchor this 1792 pounds to modern purchasing power. Using a relative income measure like GDP per capita, £1 in 1792 translates to roughly $2,166 in 2020 dollars.
So we apply that multiplier to Paine's tax brackets. Tell us the threshold. Where does that 100% rate kick in today?
Paine's 100% marginal rate kicks in on the returns from wealth, totaling about $49.7 million in annual revenue today.
$50 million a year.
Just under. And if you assume a reasonable 5% rate of return on wealth, this means the 100% tax applies to the return derived from an estate worth just under $1 billion, about $994 million.
So Paine's tax is literally calibrated for the modern billionaire class.
Precisely. It was designed to stop the formation of dynastic wealth, and it lines up almost perfectly with today's billionaire threshold.
Wait, so $49.7 million in annual revenue from wealth is where the 100% ceiling starts. But what is the absolute maximum after-tax income derived from wealth that anyone could keep after you account for the lower brackets?
That ceiling, based on the calculation of all the lower brackets and rates, is capped at $26.7 million per year. Any returns, any capital gains, income, dividends, or imputed value beyond that $26.7 million annual figure would be taxed at 100%.
So if a modern billionaire, like say Jeff Bezos, had a year where his wealth grew by, say, $50 billion due to skyrocketing stock value, a theoretical return on his estate, what would happen under the Paine plan?
If you interpret that increase as return on estate value, that massive multi-billion-dollar gain would be almost entirely captured by the government. He would be left with that capped $26.7 million annual growth from his wealth.
It's still a lot of money.
It's a huge amount of money. And it's important to note that the $26.7 million annual allowance still permits significant accumulation. Over a decade, that's over $250 million in growth allowed. But it radically restricts the dizzying exponential acceleration of wealth we see today. The constraint is political. It's about ensuring that private fortune cannot become a source of unrestrained public power that threatens the republic.
The political intent is everything here. This wasn't just about fixing the economy for Paine. He was fighting aristocracy. He fundamentally believed that the accumulation of extreme wealth was an inherent existential threat to the Republican experiment he helped create.
He saw concentrated wealth as a corrosive force. Paine argued that oppression is often the consequence of extreme wealth, because such wealth diminishes the spirit of patriotism.
What did he mean by that? Diminishes patriotism?
He meant that when the rich fear political instability more than they value liberty, they become willing to submit to tyranny to protect their fortunes. They'll make a deal with a dictator if it keeps the masses from demanding change. And that, of course, undercuts the very foundation of a revolution based on liberty.
And he didn't see democracy as a sufficient safeguard against this. He believed that even with freedom of elections, the wealthy elite would inevitably corrupt the process.
Absolutely. His core objective was to eliminate the vicious influence of the aristocratical system, because the freedom of elections was perpetually violated by the overbearing influence of inherited wealth. For Paine, liberty wasn't just about voting rights. It was about overturning all systems of domination, and he recognized that political and economic oppression are two sides of the same coin.
It's fascinating how this question of economic domination of oligarchy divided the Founding Fathers themselves. The analysis contrasts Thomas Paine's radical solution with the internal debates between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson.
And that's a crucial debate. Adams was the founder who was truly obsessed with oligarchy. He feared what he terms soft oligarchy, the power wealth accrues simply because human nature is drawn to status and fortune.
He felt the other framers missed this.
He did. Adams keenly felt the framers failed, noting they focused entirely on balancing governmental powers, executive, judicial, legislative, but they completely neglected balancing the power of government against the disproportionate power held by wealthy private citizens.
And his definition of who counted as an aristocrat was purely based on influence, not on a royal title.
Right. He defined an aristocrat or an oligarch not by a royal decree, but by practical impact. Those who can command, influence, or procure more than an average of votes. Adams recognized that wealth and family name are essentially political currencies that can overpower virtue and talent.
So what was his solution? It was pretty strange.
His solution was highly criticized. He wanted to corral the rich, the most illustrious, as he called them, into a separate body, the Senate. This was meant as a form of ostracism, separating them from the general population where their wealth could corrupt things. But critics, including Jefferson, argued it simply legitimized and elevated the oligarchs, giving them their own house of government.
Meanwhile, Jefferson had this profoundly different, almost naive view of the threat.
Jefferson's great fear was monarchy rule by the one. He feared a new king far more than he feared aristocracy or rule by the few. He was an optimist, believing that the corrupt inherited Old-world aristocracies would be replaced by new natural aristocracies of virtue and talent.
He thought that if the government was democratic, wealth and title would just cease to matter.
He did, but Adams proved to be the more accurate prophet, didn't he? He anticipated that wealth and family name would easily and consistently overwhelm virtue.
And he was right.
He was definitely more cynical and arguably more realistic. Adams felt Jefferson was dangerously naive to assume oligarchy would simply wither if it was denied direct governmental power. We see the clear revival of this today in the phenomenon that's often called patrimonial capitalism.
Just explain that.
It's capitalism dominated by inherited wealth. When you look at figures whose success has fundamentally built a top generational wealth and inherited name recognition, like Donald Trump, it illustrates Adams's fear perfectly, that meritocracy and talent are easily overwhelmed by sheer unearned inheritance.
And this leads to an even deeper psychological analysis that the sources introduce, the concept of why voters might actually choose oligarchy. This is where the idea of Trump envy and Adams's insights into human vanity intersect.
It's a chillingly universal psychological explanation. Adams argued that the wealthy hold sway because of a deep human desire to be seen, heard, talked of, approved, and respected. People associate with the rich because it confers status. They want to be close to power and the symbols of success. This isn't about policy or virtue, it's about social currency.
That dynamic suggests the 2024 election cycle was possibly the first time in American history where a large block of voters specifically chose oligarchy, not in spite of democracy, but because they were disillusioned by the so-called meritocrats.
That's a very provocative thought. The idea is that voters often don't want to trust the natural aristocracy, the highly credentialed experts or virtuous public servants that Jefferson envisioned. Instead, they're drawn to the patrimonial capitalist, the one who can transgress beyond our wildest dreams and get away with it all because he was rich.
And what's the appeal there?
That figure represents an unattainable freedom and a defiance of norms, and for some voters, associating with that figure feels empowering. Adams identified this force, this potent mix of envy and status-seeking, all the way back in the 1790s, and it makes democracy incredibly vulnerable when wealth concentration reaches extreme levels.
Which is why Paine sought to cut the political legs out from under that concentrated wealth to make it impossible for such figures to even exist. So it remains this massive question. How could the architect of the American Revolution publish such a detailed, comprehensive blueprint for a just society and have it vanish so completely that 2 centuries later, describing his ideas sounds like a radical European manifesto?
It was a perfect storm of bad political timing and unsuitable structural conditions in the fledgling United States. A real case of the right idea in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Let's start with the timing, what the sources call the inopportune moment of 1797.
By the late 1790s, the revolutionary fire had really waned on both sides of the Atlantic. In England, Paine's core radical constituency, the working-class reformers who would have championed agrarian justice, was under intense governmental suppression. Many were imprisoned, their organizations were banned, and key figures had fled, which really reduced their ability to sustain a political movement for change.
And in the U.S., the moment for that kind of sweeping radical change had already passed.
Exactly. Agrarian justice arrived too late. By 1796-97, the radical discourse had shifted to the political margins. The focus of the new nation was on institutional stabilization, commerce, and westward expansion, not on massive economic restructuring and mandatory compensation for the landless. The energy for that kind of fight was gone.
And his specific program was politically awkward. It didn't fit neatly into the existing conservative or radical camps.
It was a very intellectual compromise, which is often described as being too cerebral. On one hand, it alienated the ultra-radicals, people like Thomas Spence or Gracchus Babeuf, who were demanding outright land expropriation and collectivism. Paine explicitly ruled out land confiscation. He respected private property rights, provided that restitution was paid.
But on the other hand?
On the other hand, it was far too comprehensive and non-incremental to appeal to your average reformer. Paine's plan was this complicated, carefully reasoned balance between conservative property rights and radical egalitarianism, which meant it failed to stir the passions of the masses the way the simple, powerful rhetoric of common sense had.
It sounds like it was simply too nuanced to succeed in a heated political climate. But the sources also point to some very unique conditions in the U.S. that made Paine's European-born solutions seem less urgent.
Yes, and the primary structural difference was what historians call the frontier safety valve.
The idea that you could always go west.
Right. In the American context, especially when you discount the rights of native peoples, the U.S. had what seemed like an indefinite amount of land available for the taking in the West. If you were poor and landless in Massachusetts, the prevailing wisdom, however flawed that wisdom was move west and stake a claim.
So unlike in Britain or France, where the land was completely enclosed and being landless was a permanent structural condition,
The American context provided this temporary illusion of economic escape. The urgent question for the U.S. government was how to settle and distribute unclaimed land, not how to subsidize a permanent landless class of citizens. In contrast, France and Britain were full nations, where landlessness was an inescapable reality, which made Paine's compensation scheme immediately relevant over there.
there's also the issue of the growing American population and the fear of who would benefit from a universal dividend scheme.
That's the other unique factor. The ethnic heterogeneity and open borders of the U.S. made a mandatory dividend scheme a tough sell. There was a deep-seated suspicion, even in the early republic, of freeloaders.
The fear that immigrants would come just for the money.
Precisely. The fear was that an influx of immigrants would rush in merely to claim the universal payments, taxing the existing citizenry. This anti-freeloader mindset is a persistent American anxiety, something we still see today. For instance, when the Alaska Permanent Fund was established in the 1970s, Alaskans immediately worried about outsiders swarming the state just for the dividend checks. That xenophobic resistance made Paine's universal dividend politically toxic from the start.
And yet, despite being neglected in his own time, Paine's work didn't just disappear. It was placed on a shelf and rediscovered by subsequent generations. Today, he's recognized as the intellectual powerhouse behind much of our modern safety net architecture.
He is undeniably the godfather of the modern safety net. Agrarian Justice is the direct intellectual precursor to Social Security, unemployment insurance, child allowances, and the entire contemporary universal basic income movement. The idea that citizens are owed a dividend from a common resource, whether it's land or oil revenue like in Alaska, or simply the accumulated public value of the economy, that is Paine's enduring philosophical gift.
And his tax proposal highlights a technical distinction that is really critical to modern policy debates, particularly around the constitutionality of a wealth tax.
This is a crucial area. Remember, Paine taxed the return from wealth, the yearly value, not the wealth corpus, the net worth. Modern proposals like Senator Elizabeth Warren's ultramillionaire tax, or UMT, face constitutional scrutiny because the U.S. Constitution treats a direct tax differently from an income tax.
So how does Paine's focus on taxing the return clarify this distinction for us?
It illustrates the economic equivalence and sort of cuts through the legal weeds. Think of it simply. Taxing a person's total net worth, say a 5% tax on their house, is economically equivalent to taxing the total profit they make from that wealth, say a 100% tax on the rent, if the return is 5%.
So you get to the same place.
You get the same place. Paine's proposal taxing the return at 100% above a certain threshold demonstrates that you can achieve the redistributive effect of a wealth tax without necessarily taxing the corpus itself. It makes the tax-based distinction, which is often used in legal arguments, seem less important than the real political and economic effect, which is constraining accumulation.
Let's put Paine's radical plan side by side with some modern, aggressive proposals. We have Senator Elizabeth Warren's UMT, Senator Ron Wyden's billionaire's income tax, and the proposed inheritance tax by Professor Lily Batchelder. This comparison really shows how Paine's ambition stacks up.
Yeah, it does. We can use the details to see the striking symmetry and the ultimate radical difference.
Let's start with the tax base. What is each proposal actually trying to capture?
Okay, so Paine taxed the yearly value, or the return derived from the estate. Warren's UMT targets net worth, the total wealth itself. Wyden's BIT is aimed at unrealized income or accrual, meaning paper gains are taxed annually.
Which equalizes the tax liability between wage earners and billionaires who often don't sell their stock.
Exactly. And then Batchelder targets the inheritance, or the transfer of wealth upon death. You can see they're all trying to limit extreme concentration, but they attack the problem at different points in the wealth cycle.
And their target populations are precisely aligned with Paine's focus on those 200 wealthiest British households.
Absolutely. Paine targeted estates that generated annual revenue over $49.7 million, which means close to $1 billion in total value. Warren targets net worth over $1 billion. Wyden targets assets over $1 billion, or income over $100 million. They are all zeroed in on the modern billionaire class, which reflect the political danger posed by these vast individual fortunes.
But the philosophical goal is what really ties them together, showing this consistency in anti-oligarchic thought over 2 centuries.
That's the most compelling link. Warren wants to remediate political corruption and equalize the ability to pay. Wyden seeks fairness in the tax system. Batchelder aims to equalize opportunity by addressing inherited economic power. Paine, however, was arguably the clearest and most absolute. His goal was to prohibit luxury wealth and entirely eliminate the political and social influence of the aristocratic system.
And the radical difference is that constraint on accumulation, it's the 100% rate.
Indeed. Only Paine set a 100% marginal rate, imposing a strict ceiling on annual return at $26.7 million. The modern proposals apply aggressive but, much lower top rates. Warren's UMT tops out at 6%, Wyden's BIT at 40.8%, and Batchelder's inheritance tax at 49.5%.
If we look purely at the math, Paine's updated $49.7 million revenue threshold for the 100% tax shows an astonishing convergence of policy ambition with modern reformers. It's all driven by the same fear of the political dangers of extreme wealth concentration.
It does. It shows that reformers today are still wrestling with the same Gilded Age levels of inequality that Paine saw in the 18th century. But only Paine was willing to take that ultimate political step. Naming a specific amount of wealth, return a prohibitable luxury, and backing it up with a 100% tax rate, explicitly stating that accumulation beyond that point cannot be tolerated in a free republic.
We started this deep dive with the premise that Thomas Paine provides this powerful critique of the conventional American founding narrative. He gives us a metric for what a truly civilized society should look like. I want to read this quote. "My poor are happy, my jails are empty of prisoners, my streets of beggars, the aged are not in want, the taxes are not oppressive." He alone connected political liberty to mandatory economic security.
And this call for economic justice creates an ultimate tension when you juxtapose it against the realities of the American founding. Paine's ideals clashed directly with the conservative, land-centric foundation of the Republic, which, relied heavily on settler colonialism.
We have to acknowledge that the United States, as an entity, was founded on a framework of white supremacy, African slavery, and a policy of genocide and land theft. Settler colonialism is the defining mechanism of the early republic.
And you have to understand what settler colonialism is. It's the deliberate project to replace an indigenous population with an invading settler society. And it inherently requires violence to acquire the land that is deemed necessary for life. Many scholars categorize U.S. policies toward indigenous peoples as classic cases of imperialism and a particular form of colonialism.
And part of that was erasing the history.
A huge part. The foundational process was to systematically erase the prior existence of indigenous peoples through strategies like firsting and lasting, where local histories narrate the first white settlement and the last Indian, thereby perpetually justifying the land acquisition as inevitable or as happening on empty land.
And once that land was violently transferred from indigenous groups to settlers, its entire value changed fundamentally.
It went from being viewed as sacred or necessary for life, as it often was for indigenous cultures, to being purely private property. It became a commodity to be acquired, accumulated, and sold. This transformation reduced the American project, in many eyes, to a quest for wealth and land accumulation, which fueled the very aristocratic systems Paine was fighting against back in Britain.
Paine, despite being the anti-monarchist radical, didn't fully resolve this colonial issue. He focused on compensating those dispossessed by civilization by the move from hunting to agriculture and enclosure, rather than addressing the specific land theft from indigenous nations.
That's a critical distinction. His focus was on the philosophical loss of common inheritance due to agricultural society, which is a very European framework. However, the mechanism he created, a universal basic income funded by a tax on the inheritance of land wealth, offers a potential path, if you were to repurpose it, toward broad restitution and economic justice. That path was completely absent in the prevailing conservative view of the founding, which prioritized the acquisition and maintenance of private property above all else.
This makes his ideas acutely relevant today, not just as a historical curiosity, but because our contemporary economic reality is mirroring the conditions that spurred Paine to write in the first place.
The symmetry is haunting. At the start of the 19th century, the top 1% of British estates held about 24% of all wealth. Today, the top 1% of American households holds 27% of total wealth. Paine's plan is not a vague historical artifact. It is a meticulously calibrated democratic bulwark against oligarchy, designed for the exact level of wealth concentration we face right now.
He understood that the revolution he sparked was incomplete until that economic tyranny was also addressed.
Absolutely. Paine was unique in demanding that the freedom he fought for had two inseparable dimensions: freedom from political tyranny, the king and parliament, and freedom from economic tyranny, the unchecked power of the aristocracy and these overgrown estates.
So as we consider how to preserve and expand democracy in an age of rising inequality, Paine forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that extremes of wealth are simply extremes of power.
And that a truly free self-governing republic may require a radical plan dating nearly to its founding to strictly limit the accumulation of wealth and ensure economic dignity for all. The modern debate over a 100% marginal tax rate is fundamentally a debate about whether we, as a democratic society, are finally ready to place a clear, definitive political limit on economic power.